the gunpowder plot. But this is not a ruin. It was actually never completed. The workmen downed tools here in 1605. Then it was a place of riddles. Today it's still a horticultural puzzle. This is Lyveden New Bield. In the reign of Elizabeth I, this was a garden to die for. It followed the newfound garden fashion of theatre and sophistication. It may not look much today, but even after 400 years, there are plenty of clues to allow us to build up a picture of this lavish design. An evocative building that dominates the landscape. An elaborate watercourse that surrounds a square field, the corners of which are dominated by earth mounds in the shapes of cones and pyramids. Lyveden, near Oundle in Northamptonshire, is a real hidden garden. Over the last 7 years, the National Trust have cleared the bracken to reveal the basic structure, the snail mounds and the moats. But now the real detective work is underway to find out more about what was originally here. Mark Bradshaw is leading this long-term restoration. There's some extraordinary features in this landscape, the mounds and the moats, the buildings themselves. But the big question is who owned this property? Who was this landscape developed for?
Well, it's largely the creation of Sir Thomas Tresham, who was a real character, I think, of Elizabethan England. He was wealthy from his estate here at Lyveden. He was wealthy from other land he owned. He had high social status as well. And really, as Elizabethans love to do, he wanted to show off his wealth.
So here's a man with money, influence, wealth and attitude. But just what are we looking at here?
Well, what he's trying to put forward are the features of the contemporary gardens of Elizabethan England, using mounts, using moats, and trying to fill those in with a planting scheme that was to be the height of fashion of that time.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because many of the architectural features and landscaping features do remain, even some 400 years later. But what do we know about the horticulture that was contained within this garden?
Well, at the moment, we know very little. We've been working for some 7 years on clearing back 400 years of scrub and neglect. By clearing through this bramble and thicket, we've gradually uncovered through that window these features still existing in their original position as they were left when tools were put down 400 years ago. Adding on to that framework, we now want to try and discover, well, how far did he get when work stopped? And hopefully we want to piece together how it linked up. We know the position of the original house at the bottom of the valley. We've still got a magnificent building up at the top here, but what went on in between?
The overriding desire whenever you visit a building like this is just to get in and explore. It's a curious building, and even though it's virtually derelict inside, there's still plenty to be learned from just looking around. This lower layer, for instance, it's very simple architecture, very clean stonework, perhaps the servants' quarters. But as you move further up, the stonework gets much more ornate until right on the top layer, that's where the sumptuous apartments are. That is the best view of the garden. The grandeur extends throughout the building, which is kind of curious when you consider that this wasn't even the main house. Tresham described this as his garden lodge, but look at the degree of decoration around the main archway, and also up in the corner, the niche, where almost certainly there'd have been a statue of the Virgin Mary. It's got a very eerie feel to the building, almost as if you shouldn't be here. But if you have a look around, I'm obviously not the first. Graffiti from 1745. Sir Thomas Tresham was a wealthy Elizabethan landowner who, like many of his contemporaries, set about displaying his wealth. But unlike his contemporaries, he was swimming against the religious tide of the day because he was a convert to Roman Catholicism. In 1581, he was arrested on suspicion of harbouring the Jesuit missionary Edmund Campion. Guilty, as charged.
Just 30 years ago, a priest hole was discovered hidden deep in the cellar below Rushton Hall, Tresham's other family home, near Kettering. In it was found, among other more worldly goods, a sanctus or communion bell dated 1580. Here, a Catholic priest had hidden from persecution and almost certain death. Here, Sir Thomas had received Mass, and for his refusal to abandon his faith, Tresham was imprisoned or under house arrest and suffered crippling fines for the rest of his life. But it didn't stop him proclaiming his faith in a very bold way.
We got 25 feet.
There's 5 fives.
What you got there? We have got 5 feet.
Okay.
Go around the side here.
We've got 3s as well, 3 shields.
Yeah, 3 shields here, divided by 3 windows. Into the corner here, and we've got 23.
Okay, how's that working?
So we've got 23 the other side as well. That's given us 46. We've got 25 on the front bay. That's given us 71. We've got 5 here.
Yeah.
5 the other side.
Yeah.
Another 10. 81.
You're making this up, aren't you?
3 by 3 by 3 by 3. 81.
Okay. So at the moment we've got everything laid out in 3s and 5s.
Yeah.
Right.
There's also 7s. If we look at the symbolism on the frieze, depicting the crucifixion, the 7 symbols, starting at the end with Judas's leather bag, coming through to the cross and the P, Christus Pontifex. Count them up.
3, 4, 5, 6. You're right, 7.
7.
So what's the significance of 3, 5 and 7?
Well, 3 is the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son and Holy Ghost. 5, the number of wounds on Christ on the cross. And 7, the number of symbols of the Passion.
So in fact, just about everything about the building relates back to that religious symbolism.
Yeah.
And that must surely include the incomplete building itself, clearly laid out in the shape of a cross. Today, it seems a slightly wacky idea that 400 years ago, you turn up in your best doublet and hose to one of Thomas Tresham's garden parties and spend the afternoon tickled pink by his mathematical riddles and wowing at his religious symbols. But the more you look at Tresham's architecture, the less fanciful it seems. Nicknamed Thomas the Builder, Tresham was also responsible for creating this remarkable triangular lodge at Rushton. Whilst its very shape celebrates the Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, many of its symbols are far less easy to interpret. It's a convoluted, cryptic crossword in masonry, there to be interpreted by those who had the wit to do so. For example, each side is 33 feet wide. 33? The age of Christ. Again, each side has a group of windows, 3 on one side, 5 on another, and 7 on a third. So we know that Tresham planned his buildings with mathematical precision and with great symbolism, following the fashions of the day in art, poetry, and architecture. But what about the garden? Did Tresham follow these patterns through in his planting schemes?
Okay, I'm convinced on the building. But in the landscape, I mean, you're standing in the middle of a square here, so it's 4. So surely there can't be symbolism here as well.
Well, you've now moved from the built environment 400 years ago to the natural environment, and 400 years makes a big difference in the natural environment. So much of it is covered over as we see it here today. But the plan was to have this grid form of pathway, so you had 3 by 3, almost creating 9 parterres, and in that was to be a quincunx of orchard trees, like the 5 you see on a dice.
So Mark has clues about what Tresham planned. But where does his evidence come from?
From the letters which he wrote. Now, in prison for 15 of his last 25 years, a lot of the direction was from under house arrest or in prison to the foreman on the ground. These letters hidden away in Rushton Hall, later discovered in the early 1800s, and describe in fascinating detail what he planned and probably what was undertaken here. One in particular from 1597, so 8 years before work stopped here.
I've directed George how to draw the perimeter of the garden plot wherein my garden lodge now standeth. Within the walls it is 108 yards square, facing the new gardening quarter, which is reserved for a quincunx of quince, peach, damson trees, etc. I would have a flat piece of grass hereafter levelled for a bowling green.
Tresham. Yours, Mr. Thomas Tresham.
Bless him, his handwriting isn't terrific, is it?
Claire Bentz has spent years trying to decipher Tresham's spidery scrawl. But what can we extract from the letter? What is it all about?
Amongst other things, he's giving his steward directions as to exactly what he wants done in terms of planting of hedges, what species he wants the orchard stocked with, and he goes into a lot of detail where to go to get the different varieties.
I think I have some of that here, Claire, on this one. You know, apples written here, and then species within that, great green custard, French custard, harvest apples, and so on, and then listings of when they're to come into harvest. So really, you're getting an orchard that's taking you right throughout the year, or the fruit to store throughout the year.
Right the way through from the end of August, right the way through till after Easter, and it had a succession of food coming in to the estate.
Technically, I mean, that's very advanced. Is this information coming straight off the top of his head? Is he a very well-educated horticulturalist? Or does he have access to a library?
He had one of the best libraries in Tudor England. He had an awful lot of books.
So when he was in prison, was he allowed to take his books with him?
Yes, there are other letters which say, you know, can you please send me this book? And they were obviously being delivered to him in prison, so he had the time to think about all this.
Most of his books were weighty tomes in Latin, but for the first time in history, books were now available in English. Amongst them, books on gardening by the likes of John Gerard and Thomas Hill. The plants and gardens they describe were considered the height of fashion. So where does Lyveden fit in?
It's a mixture. It's the transition between the old medieval garden, which was just for food and medicinal herbs, and we've still got that with the succession of apples right the way through the year. And it moves on from that to being more garden fashion and fun. So you've got the bowling green, you've got the fish in the moats for fishing.
Is there any indication within the documents as to Tresham's favourite flowers? Anything new and fashionable that he was willing to try out?
He talks about the roses, both damask and red roses. Now, we've got Elizabeth on the throne at the time, and you've got the rose, symbol of the Tudor Queen, which is interesting because, of course, that's showing allegiance to the crown, even though he was Catholic. He also talks about cherry trees and plum trees to be planted on the outside of the moated orchard. And again, we've got bullace trees, damson trees, cherry plums growing there today still. So it looks as though some things were planted.
Can we tell whether Tresham was leading fashion? Is he right on the cutting edge?
I think he was just following.
So he
was at the forefront. He was a modern, fashionable garden, but he wasn't doing anything that was brand new.
So if he'd have been alive today, he'd have been painting his walls blue and putting up stainless steel features.
I think so, yes.
Thomas Tresham's letter is extraordinary. It's such a personal document, a dream that escaped through the walls of his prison cell. It's like having the man himself talking to you, and it clearly describes the kind of garden he wanted. The list of fruit trees would have made any Elizabethan's mouth water. The next stage of Mark's restoration is to find these ancient varieties of fruit to replant the orchards. So I've come here to the National Fruit Collection at Brogdale in Kent, where Nick Wiles may be able to help to supply the old varieties.
Today it seems like a very strange concept to establish a garden which is based entirely around an orchard. We think of them as being purely productive spaces, isn't it? Here it's very ornamental.
Yeah, so in that time it would have been a great status symbol to have a large orchard so prominently placed in your garden. Also, of course, it means that you've got fruit on your table most of the year round, which is a great sort of status symbol to have.
So the larger and glossier and more juicy the fruits.
Absolutely, the sexiness of the orchard, yes, absolutely. Nowadays people have big red flashy sports cars. They used to have big orchards full of big apples in those days. And of course you could always go and hide under the trees and have a secret little tryst with a lover.
Mark has also travelled to Brogdale to look for some of Tresham's old fruit varieties with expert Mike Austin.
Here's the old Pearmain.
That's certainly an impressive apple, isn't it? We know that this variety is detailed in Tresham's letters. Was it brought over during that Elizabethan period?
No, probably before that time, more like the 13th century. Probably came over from France originally.
Let's give it a try anyway. So this is a dessert apple as opposed to a cooking apple.
Should have a nice sweet, sharp taste.
That is very good, very good. Nearly as good as it looks.
That's good to hear. Oh, golden hiver this time.
Bit small. Crab apple?
Well, will you try one? Not a crab apple.
Very nice. Very sweet.
You'll find this with some of the old varieties. They're not very big and they're not very good to look at, but the flavour is great. It used to be called the brandy apple at one time and makes very, very strong cider.
We'll have some of those at Lyveden.
So, that's 2 down, only another 15 to go.
Well, being a Worcestershire lad, I recognise this one. A good old black Worcester pear.
Yes, it's a very old dessert pear, and actually it's on the Lyveden planting list.
Well, the ones I recognise and remember from my childhood are much, much taller than this. I mean, almost as tall as the windbreak poplars behind you.
And of course they would have been that tall, the plants in that orchard. You would have found 25, 30 foot tall trees.
So the whole of the canopy would have been hoisted up in the air.
You'd have been able to walk underneath a 6, 7 foot high canopy.
Right. So that's slightly puzzling, though, because all of these fabulous fruits that the gardeners are trying to develop are then well out of visual reach, aren't
Yes, but because they had the snail mounds in the corner of the orchards, didn't they? So they probably would have taken their guests up the snail mounds, which would put them on eye level with the canopy of the trees, so they could have seen the beautiful fruits in the autumn time and all the wonderful blossom in the spring.
they? So, in fact, the construction of the snail mounds confirms the status
Absolutely.
of the orchard, the fact that this is exactly what I want you to
Great
see.
vantage point to show off from. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah. You want to try one?
No, I actually made that mistake when I was a kid. They are disgusting, and they're unripe.
Rather unpleasant taste. Best for the pot.
Incredibly, Brogdale can supply every one of the old varieties of fruit needed to recreate Lyvden's orchards. But what of the other plants? Tresham mentions roses, strawberries and perennials in his prison letters. But were his planting plans ever realised? Or was his garden, like his building, left incomplete when he died in 1605?
Remarkably, the answer may lie at the bottom of the moat. And if you want to get to the bottom of a moat, who do you call in?
Hands on, lift up. Hands on, lift up.
Members of the 39 Engineer Regiment from Cambridge have joined forces with Dr. Chris Hunt and his team from Huddersfield University in a search like looking for a needle in a haystack.
OK, Chris, 400 years after the garden was last used, we've got the Royal Engineers here and a team of geographers. What are you looking for?
We're hoping that pollen grains will have survived in the mud that will have built up at the bottom of this moat. The idea is that each year leaves die, fall in the moat, land on the bottom, and they bury anything else that's come in over the time, and that will include pollen grains from trees and flowers. And those pollen grains are remarkably distinctive.
So what's buried at the bottom of the moat here is literally a time capsule?
Absolutely.
OK, well, let's see how they get on.
There we go. That's it. Wow. What have we got? Well, this is brilliant because we've got a whole story here. At the bottom, what you've got is this grey stuff, which is the bottom of the moat. And straight on top of that, you've got material here which must have fallen in pretty well straight away. So that should have the story of the garden as it was actually being constructed in it, with a bit of luck. So here, probably you've got about 4 or 5 years. And then in this part, you've got the other 400 odd years of the story of the moat.
While the team continues to search for pollen, I'm going to one of Tresham's old gardening neighbours to hunt for more evidence on how Lyveden fits into garden history.
This is Burley House outside Stamford, just 20 miles away from Lyveden New Bield. Since the 16th century, it's been home to the Cecil family, and recently a document has been unearthed here which sheds new light on the garden back at Lyveden.
And I'm here to meet garden historian Dr. Paula Henderson.
What's been discovered, Paula?
Oh, it's an amazing plan. It was discovered about 2 years ago behind a cabinet here in the Muniments room by the archivist. And it's the earliest plan of identifiable garden in England. So at first we thought it was 17th century, but then we recognized Lord Burleigh's own handwriting here on the map. So it had to be before he died in 1598. And then through looking at the archives and various things, we were able to date it to 1562 to 7. And it's quite amazing because it shows William Cecil's house, and this house was right across the street from the Savoy. So here's the Strand here, and Covent Garden, undeveloped at that point, is at the top.
OK, that's a remarkable story, but what relevance does this have to Lyveden New Bield? Why is this so important?
Well, Lyveden, like all of Lord Burleigh's gardens, was a very important garden in the period, and this garden shares some of the characteristics of all gardens, like Lyveden.
I mean, one of the obvious things is that, which I would guess is a snail mound.
Yes, it is a snail mount, and a mount that, like the mounts at Lyveden, would have given you a place to look out over the garden and over the landscape beyond.
And is that an orchard?
Yes, it is, and a very long orchard. And amazing that he had an orchard this size in London, but planted in quincunxes, this form of fives that was really typical from the Renaissance on. And someone like William Cecil and Thomas Tresham thought of gardens and architecture as one unity. That's one of the most amazing things about this plan, is that from the beginning you have this very important London house, and yet laid out perfectly in this axial drawing of the land around it. And Tresham clearly was interested in that too. So it's something they learned from books, but it's also something they learned from each other.
What we can conclude from this plan is that the plan is showing on paper what Lyveden is showing on the ground.
Absolutely, yes. Just this interest in combining beautiful architecture with very beautifully laid out gardens was just a part of a nobleman's interests.
Not wishing to be outdone, Tresham took a nobleman's interests to extremes. Where Cecil had built one snail mount in the Strand, Tresham had two at Lyveden, as well as his two pyramids, and yet a third at the spectacular family estate at Rushton. Throughout the UK at this moment in garden history, everyone wanted a snail mount. The surprise is that the mounts at Lyveden survived. But Tresham's Lyveden is about more than just snail mounts. This is Holdenby House, also in Northamptonshire, and built in the same period as Lyveden. I've come here to find out about the range of flowers available at the time.
In the 1980s, the great horticulturalist Rosemary Beery was commissioned to design an Elizabethan knot garden in miniature to demonstrate the range of plants that were available to the gardener of the day. And this is the result. Some of the plants in here are no surprise. There's wonderful topiarised Buxa sempervirens, and then the lush green foliage of the bay. There are also medicinal and culinary plants, things like carpeting thyme. But there are some surprises. The vivid pinks of Lychnis chalcedonica, or the delicate, fragrant flowers of Rosamundia that contrast so wonderfully with the acid yellows of the Hemeracalis. The big question, of course, is, are the pollen grains from any of these plant species present in the moat at Lyveden?
The results of the pollen samples have arrived, and they are remarkable. The pollen deposits in the mud chart a constant change in land use over the last 400 years. But nestled right at the bottom of the sample is a thin layer that's very different from the rest. In it, there's the pollen of roses, pinks, campions, of plums, anemones, wormwood, and a plethora of other herbs. This wasn't a field, it was a garden, at least partly planted up during Tresham's time. But by the early 1600s, this exotic pollen had simply vanished. Thomas Tresham died in September 1605. 2 months later, on November the 5th, his son Francis joined Guy Fawkes and other conspirators in an attempt to kill King James I. Francis had been incensed by the treatment of Catholics in general, and in particular his father. For 25 years, Thomas Tresham had been prosecuted for his faith and persecuted even after his death.
And I suppose the ultimate insult, they dug up and sold 500 of his favourite trees to pay off his fines.
The failure of the gunpowder plot sealed the fate of the Tresham family and of this garden. Francis died a traitor in the Tower of London, a well-documented story. But it's only now that the immediate decline of the garden has been revealed in the minute pollen dredged from the bottom of the moat. So 400 years after Tresham's death, his orchard is reawakened. And although it'll take a further 50 years for these trees to mature, that is only a brief moment in the life of a garden like Lyveden.
It's nice to see an avenue of walnuts as well, because that's something you don't see very often these days.
It very much went out of fashion sort of 300 years ago when they started bringing in mahogany, or seen as a better wood. But walnut was a damn good species because, of course, the nuts it produces, but also the husks used for dyeing wool, the leaves as a gargle for sore throats.
That's all very well, but I mean, the real reason that it was grown was to keep the Morris men out of trouble. In some areas of Britain, the whole kind of story about Morris men is that they'd go around and beat the walnut with their staffs.
All right.
And it's all become part of the Morris man ritual. And they used to beat the bark of the tree because in beating it, it convinces the tree that it's suffering, it's struggling.
Right.
And of course, a plant under threat produces more flower. More flower means more fruit. So in a way, beating the bark of a walnut with a Morris man, well, not with the Morris man, obviously, but, you know, with the Morris man's staff, is going to produce more fruit. So you can try it.
Yeah, I might be coming back to you on that one, though.
I like the avenue there. I mean, this is just going to look absolutely stunning.
So gradually the grand avenue to the moated orchard is beginning to take shape, as described in Tresham's letters. But there's a section in one of the letters that's always proved a puzzle. In it, Tresham describes his desire to have a bowling green and a diamond-patterned parterre in front of the new build for his flowers and some of the more exotic fruits like peach and quince. But was this section of the garden ever made?
We undertook geophysics in this area, and it shows some of the detail. You can pick out these faint lines coming across here, again here, and then coming across in this direction, which relate clearly to this diamond pattern, which were detailed in his letters of the 1590s.
I mean, it is odd because, you know, look at the scale of the building, which is pretty imposing behind me, and then you look at the scale of this parterre. I mean, that is an enormous...
Very much so.
You know, I would say that if you've only got the evidence of the letter to create that pattern, then, you know, I'm not sure whether the landscape would actually be in place. There's little evidence of it today. But then when you combine the letter with the geophysics and you start to get... There's two very distinctive paths there, which is very, very clear. You start to get a picture that maybe this garden was in place, but it's still very hazy, and it does beg the question, could those not be something like sheep tracks, for instance?
You're unlikely to get sheep tracks coming that wide, and also following that pattern. And if you measure between those, it's exactly the same as the measurements from his letters of that pathway spacing.
So what you're saying is, unless we've got very organised and very geometric sheep, we have got the written evidence and we've got the geophysical evidence. It's just the garden was in place. Who sprayed that one?
The line's broken. The line...
It's taken 7 years to reach this magical point in Lyvedon's story, and the discovery that the diamond parterre still lies slumbering beneath the soil after 400 years shows Tresham's garden was far nearer completion than we could ever have imagined.
The real irony here is that had Tresham realised his dreams, the garden being planted and the buildings finished, the chances are they'd never have survived. Lyvedon, like all gardens, would have changed with time and fashion. Successive generations of gardeners would have all wanted their input. The moats may well have been lost, and the snail mounds just simply bulldozed. But this was a garden abandoned before it was even completed, and so it slipped almost unnoticed under a cloak of wilderness, where it remained for centuries until today we really get a tantalising glimpse of a garden and its gardener from 400 years ago.